Let's take another example text and put it into Reallywrite and see what happens. Here I took a text that I started reading the other day. I found the first sentence really interesting and gripping, and after that I found it really hard to read. So I put it into Reallywrite and I see that there's a clarity score of 37. There are 3 complicated sentences, 2 very complicated sentences. There's a couple of passive voice, there's some prepositional phrases and zombie nouns. But I think what I'm mostly struggling with here is the topic position and the stress position, the old and the new, and the sheer amount of abstract information at the beginning of the sentence. And so I thought I could work through this with you today and see what else we could do with this text. So the first sentence, the one that really gripped me, was, if you could peer inside someone else's head, you'd see a scrunched up gelatinous mass of tissue weighing roughly 1 kilogram, homogeneous to the naked eye. In other words, a brain. Here I'm thinking, oh, okay, we're going to learn something really amazing about the brain, right? But then the next sentence starts with this abstract idea, the seeming uniformity of the overlying cerebral cortex, which has so outstripped other parts of the brain over the course of evolution that it makes up more than 80% of the brain, is believed by centuries of painstaking neuroscience. What? Here we've got this abstraction that includes another word for brain, and then it's interrupted by a really long, complex relative clause, and then we've got a passive voice verb buried at the end of the sentence, and then the end of the sentence, by centuries of painstaking neuroscience. That's kind of familiar and easy to process, but it's at the end of the sentence in the stress position. So here I'm thinking, okay, in order to process this sentence, I need to take it apart and figure out what it's trying to say. Here is a fact. The brain something makes up more than 80% of the brain, that uniformity of the cerebral cortex. So what could I say here? I could say more than 80% of the brain is the cerebral cortex. Now I'm introducing that cerebral cortex in the stress position. And now I'm giving some extra information about it, and it is not as homogeneous as it appears. So that gets rid of the seeming uniformity of the overlying cerebral cortex. And then all of this outstripping parts, course of evolution, I don't know. Here's the information about 80% of the brain. And then it says, is believed by centuries of neuroscience. I don't even know. Painstaking neuroscience. What are they even trying to say with that? Let's just remove it. I think I've pulled the most important information out of the sentence. More than 80% of the brain is the cerebral cortex, and it is not as homogeneous as it appears. Okay, now we get into the next one. Some of the most compelling early evidence that parts of the cortex are specialized in their duties came from gunshot wounds during the First World War. I really like that they've got these gunshot wounds here at the end of the sentence. There's that new information. Interesting. But the beginning of the sentence, some of the most compelling early evidence that parts of the cortex are specialized in their duties. This is all before the verb. And the actual subject is this word evidence. So you're not keeping me focused here on what we're actually talking about, which is the brain or the cerebral cortex. I need something short and familiar. I need a verb to be closer to the subject. What could I do here if I want to put a verb closer to the subject? I thought about, we have learned that parts of the cortex are specialized by studying, and here I get rid of the evidence, compelling evidence. Here, the parts of the cortex are specialized. That's the most important part. Can get rid of in their duties. And how did we learn that parts of the cortex are specialized? By studying gunshot wounds during the First World War. So now I'm still really connected. More than 80% of the brain is the cerebral cortex, and it is not as homogeneous as it appears. Now we've learned that parts of the cortex are specialized by studying gunshot wounds during the First World War. And then they say, for instance, bullets lodged in the back of the brain disrupted sight in discrete portions of the visual scene, prompting insights into the localization and function of visual cortex. What are they trying to say here? Bullets lodged in the back of the brain disrupted sight in discrete portions of the visual scene. Okay, that's one sentence. I'm just going to not even touch discrete portions of the visual scene, even though I think if we spent some time on it, we could do better than that. Then I'm going to make it clear what the second part of the sentence is about, prompting insights into. So what's the connection there? This information, and there's something about localization. I think what they're saying is helped us locate the visual cortex. Here. And understand how it works. Here I'm choosing verbs to try to figure out what's happening. So when I'm restructuring this for myself to try to figure out what they're actually saying, I'm going subject, verb, object. I'm trying to keep the subject concrete, human as much as possible. I'm trying to use a precise verb close to the subject, and I'm trying to use that beginning of the sentence to connect back to what we were just talking about. Here, in making sentences like this that are easier for me to process, I'm also naturally removing those orange and red sentences, and I'm keeping my focus on what it's about. Here we've got a brain, then we've got more than 80% of the brain, and here we've got the cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex is not as homogeneous as it appears. Here we've got a comfortable we, and then parts of the cortex are specialized. And we've got gunshot wounds, which makes us think bullets. And this information that was given in the last sentence helped us locate the visual cortex and understand how it works. So basically here I'm just trying to apply given to new or old to new, that information flow principle, in order to connect sentences together. Now, if we look at the next sentence, we have the study of the front of the brain. Notice noun, preposition, noun, and then here's an empty verb. Has a similar history of injury leading to insight. So this is a heavy, hard start. What else could I do? I could use some parallelism. We have learned this by studying gunshot wounds. Well, what else have we learned? We've also learned about the front of the brain. And how have we learned that? By studying brain injury. And now we're going to have an example of that brain injury, a very famous example. But it starts with Phineas Gage, a railroad worker. So here's the person. Had a 3.5-foot long tamping iron blow straight through his frontal lobes and turned from a responsible, mild-mannered geek into an unruly exhibitionist overnight. I'm going to leave that sentence alone. It's about this person and what happened to them. There's some nice parallelism there. It's a longer sentence, but that's okay because I've simplified the other more academic type sentences. And this is a sentence that really gets into the storytelling. What happened to this person? Now, as we go next, in next sentence, we have parts of the prefrontal cortex that he damaged have since been much studied for their involvement in motivation and emotional control. We can simplify this actually a little bit. Parts of the prefrontal cortex that he damaged, this emphasis on studied can be removed because we can simplify it a little bit and say are involved in, and we can take that noun involvement, we can make it into a verb and we can put the emphasis on that word. Are involved in motivation and emotional control. Now we don't have this list of nouns, zombie nouns, with kind of an empty has been studied verb. But now that we take our verb and we show the relationship, the parts of the prefrontal cortex are involved in motivation and emotional control. The relationship is that these parts are involved in control of these things. So here we have a more direct relationship. Now, if we go to the next sentence, we have more recent work has implicated other parts of the prefrontal cortex in working memory. This is a really heavy, empty, blah, blah start that does not connect me to what we were talking about before. So I want to think about what were we talking about before? I think we're talking about how can I connect? Possibly I can say other parts of the prefrontal cortex here, other parts of the prefrontal cortex, and then I need a verb. The verb here could be are implicated in working memory. And here you can simply put a reference. You're referencing, or the author was referencing these vague studies, but we don't know what these studies were. They're not here. You could remove them from the sentence and you could keep me focused on, hey, other parts of the prefrontal cortex, and then just stick a reference at the end to say, here's where you can find more about that information. Now, if we do the next one here, and then we start with working memory. I like this connection here. That makes it nice and easy. Working memory is famously illustrated by your ability to temporarily remember a 7-digit telephone number. Roughly the amount of information you can store online in working memory for the duration of a task, like phoning for a pizza. Okay, that whole bit after the 7-digit telephone number, to be honest, when I was reading this sentence, I lost the metaphor. I thought the metaphor with your ability to temporarily remember a 7-digit telephone number, that's clear, I'm with you, absolutely. But to extend that metaphor into this super long, complicated sentence about phoning for a pizza, that took my attention away from what we're actually talking about, which is the brain and how the brain works and how we know how the brain works. So here I would just cut that. You can see in this example that we had a couple of sentences that were very storytelling-like sentences because it's not taken from an academic article. But there were also a number of academic-like sentences that were really harder to process, harder than they needed to be, simply because they didn't use that old to new principle. So I think if we keep our focus on that, and that's not something that Reallywrite shows you, that's not something that Reallywrite can identify what's old information and what's new. But we can, as we revise it and as we change from old to new, then we also notice that we're simplifying sentence structures, we're moving more into subject-verb-object relationships, we're using more verbs, and the sentences are becoming much less complex. We've gotten up now to a clarity score of 75, and we started pretty low. So I would say I'm pretty happy with this progress. Maybe you would make different decisions. That's also okay. These are just one possible way of thinking about it. There are many. Try to tackle something for yourself. Put something in and see what kind of changes you might like to make. Good luck.